infant and maternal mortality, as high infant and maternal mortality as we experienced in Afghanistan, a country which had a male-dominant sex ratio, which we thought may have been due to underreporting of younger women, but which constant quality control, re-interviewing with women, and so forth indicated patterns of differential maternal and child mortality, and strong serial polygamy among men, which in the final analysis led to a sex ratio of about 115 men to women. So various adjustments were made from 74 to 79. Our observed growth rate, crude birth rate minus crude death rate, never mind for the moment the demographic fine points, was about 2.2% per year. The PDPA, when they issued their partial census in 79, showed 2.6%. The average of that is 2.4. But it also happens that there is a demographic technique which takes the observed age-sex ratios and says if now note that the ADS survey in 74 and the PDPA survey in 79 were 5 years apart. That's the common 5-year demographic cohort. It means that the children who are 5 to 9 in the ADS in 1974 are the 10 to 14-year-olds in the PDPA 1979 figures. And in general, these tests of internal demographic reasonableness stand up. And when you compare the results to similar areas in Pakistan, we find that the Afghan data looks every bit as good as the Pakistan data drawn from their surveys and censuses. So in general, the 2.4% growth rate is about what is defensible for the period 74 to 79. 79 being, of course, the benchmark year, which I don't have to identify for people in this audience. How do you get from 79 to 90? Well, first of all, you take a very hard look at the 79 figures of the PDPA regime. They published certain of these in a bulletin which is available, fugitive but available. And refugee sources did bring out handwritten tallies, Wallace-Wally by Wallace-Wally, which added up to the published total. And as I said, having adjusted the ADS figures upward by 4.6%, having then used the best available rate to get from 74 to 79, we find that the PDPA results independently derived came within 6.5% of our figures. So that's not that far off. We think we're on the right track as to how many Afghans there were alive in 1979. The nomads, the true nomads, not the partial nomads, the semi-nomads, the harvesters. The nomads are a little more difficult, but we've got evidence on that too. Admittedly, none of it published. Why? Because ADS, although we prepared for the nomad survey for 3 years, and in fact in 1974 carried out a very thoroughly aerially stratified survey of nomads, in which I took part myself for 3 months, we didn't feel confident enough in the area expansion of the sample strata to publish the results. But I have the unpublished ones, and then I later dug up in Quetta the person who is responsible for the nomad surveys carried out by the PDPA. So we have a pretty good fix on the nomad population. So in general, to get from 1979 to 1990, you multiply by the standard growth rate, which gets you to where you would be in 1990 if nothing happened, and then you factor in what happened. What's happened is there have been war deaths. There have been major migrations of refugees to Pakistan and to Iran and to elsewhere and elsewhere. Some of these people are probably lost to Afghanistan in the sense that the chances of their returning are small. We should try to figure out how many they are, but whether they are now Afghans or Iranians or Germans or Pakistanis or Americans or what, it's a little bit hard to say. The UN, I might add that there has never been a thorough count of the refugees in Pakistan, although there are official numbers of figures registered. There is conflicting evidence as to whether those figures are too high or too low or about right. And if I had more time, I would discuss what evidence there is. For my purposes, I have used the official Pakistan figures. We have a good idea from which Wallacewali they came from. We have multiplied by a sustainable or a defensible family size, and we have removed each of those people from their home in Afghanistan, from their Wallacewali, and said they are in Pakistan. We have used a sort of iterative Delphic technique, which I can talk to people about later, to come up with how many we think are in Iran who are at least reasonably likely to return. And we've juggled some nomads around to sort of, in an accounting sense, not on an individual sense, but an accounting sense, to handle the internal displacement, the migrations to the cities, and what has happened to the nomadic population. These have all been factored out by Wallacewali, so that I can announce to you in my 15 seconds more of time that as of 5:30 a.m. on February 25th, 1990, when I finally put the 1,300 row by 60 column computer spreadsheet to bed, it was ill from Asian flu in the Korean computer and Pakistani pirated software, and I was doing this at night to avoid power outages and load shedding, and to top it all off, there were viruses popping out right and left of me. I can confidently say that at 5:30 a.m. on February 25th, 1990, there were 12,363,225 people alive inside Afghanistan, more or less. I will add one other point, since this is a panel on documentation. Those results are at the printer in Peshawar now. They will be released soon to anyone who is interested in this. My principal problem is getting a proper map of the district councils of the Wallacwalis, which is about this big, because it's very hard to interpret the results without the map, and my biggest technical problem is getting that map published at a scale that's large enough for everyone to read. But these results and an interpretive paper and an accompanying map will be available. Parts of it are at the printer. The rest will be available very shortly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think in the interest of human decency, we should break for tea. And if you have questions, we are available. And if there is time left at the end of the following session, when people have exhausted their interest in those papers, perhaps we can return to these. Thank you very much.
Okay, please, we have a very short time. You have your tea only within half an hour. Please come, we start, because It also started half an hour late. If you're all the time half an hour late, then you know that you would be one talking at night. You please go that way. Asta. Two chair there. Ha. Here. Ladies and gentlemen, now the panel is starting, that is the impact of foreign aid and state society. The members of this panel are Mikhail Keating, Mr. Ashraf Ghani, Nasim Javed, Nancy Tapper, MB Naqvi. If you please occupy your chairs here. If somebody doesn't have the chair, we can provide it. Now, Mr. Abdullah Jan Khalil, he will chair this panel, and Mr. Ashraf Ghani will be the first presenter. Thank you very much.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. As the time is running short, and being the host of this August gathering, so I confine myself only to the stage secretaryship to save the time for you people. As you know all, ladies and gentlemen, the topic for discussion of this setting is the impact of foreign aid on state-society relations, the relationship of state and society, and the impact of decision regarding aid allocation. So the panel, as you know, in this session is the presenter, Mr. Ashraf Ghani, an anthropologist who will present his views, while Nasim Jawad, Nancy Tapper, MB Naqvi, and Mr. Keating will be discussing. So I request Ashraf Ghani to come and present his views. Ashraf Ghani.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Time has become a source of agony for me. February and March, in particular, are very bad months. In February, my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Said Bahauddin Majru, was brutally murdered in this city, a city which since then has become synonymous with fear, that architect of terror. There is still no report about his murder and no justice that has been given. Taking advantage of being a guest, which in Pashtun culture entitles me to 3 days of unaccountability, I would speak rather bluntly than politely. And may I request our hosts to issue a report on the climate of fear that prevents Afghans from talking freely about their future without restraint and without compulsion. Otherwise, there'd be no difference between Kabul and Peshawar. If Afghans are not allowed to talk here, then what's the difference from Kabul? March, of course, is a very sad month because I've lost another dear friend, a lifelong colleague, interlocutor, and someone whom I admired, Louis Dupree. So Nancy John, with your permission, I'll honor Louis' memory in the only way I can, by being blunt. Let me take each of the terms with which this title is laced. I apologize for not having a written text because I was in bed recovering from an operation, but this will allow me to be more spontaneous. State, society, and foreign aid are not fixed entities in space and time. Neither the Afghan state nor the Afghan society can be bounded. They've been unbounded. They've been processually remade and made continuously. Being in a phase of rupture now, we have to look to the past, both to draw examples for the future, but even more importantly, how not to repeat it. So I'll start with society prior to the state, because there's a lesson there. This region of the world was not bounded by centralized states, but we had very civilized societies. I'm referring to the period roughly from 12th century to the middle of 19th. The entities with which we are dealing as states, namely Pakistan, Afghanistan, Soviet Central Asia, are after all creations of the 19th and then 20th century. Our societies were prior to that. They were unbounded cultural groupings. You take something like the Naqshbandi order that started in Central Asia in the 13th century. By the end of 16th, it had not only encompassed all of Afghanistan, today's Pakistan, most of India, but it had made its way to Baghdad and got entrenched in Kurdistan, not to speak of Chinese Xinjiang. The point is that our cultural past has given us a horizon to look beyond the state, where people, individuals, have been the source of connections, and where that kind of relationship can be rethought. Incidentally, Peshawar again is very dear to me because there was a lovely saint here who used to accept, a wali, who used to accept lots of women as his disciples. And a king of Delhi sent him a message saying, fire and cotton do not mix. You should not accept women as your disciple. He sent him a container in which fire and cloth remained intact. So let's not be male-centered. Let's consider the wider universe of connections, because women were extremely important in these Sufi orders. The second thing, of course, also is the exchange system. As late as 1870, Multan drew its silk from Balkh in Bukhara, widely dispersed units of production and exchange. There was a larger universe in which this area of the world was bounded, which got shattered with the advent of colonialism. The last point that I'll invoke from that period is something which has been sadly missing both in history of Afghanistan and Pakistan, namely respect for an independent judiciary. The judicial system in the area during that time was not embedded within a centralized state institution. Judiciary remained independent, and I hope, one of my fond hopes is for the future that will become again so. Now I would shift. So, having argued that the society was unbounded, I would come back to what one can do with that heritage. We are struggling over a history, but history is complex, so most of us draw different lessons from it. Centralization of state power in Afghanistan took place in the context of a colonialism that threatened its very existence. Had the British Viceroys of India succeeded, the border of India should have been the Hindu Kush. But we Afghans have a way with frustrating designs of those who believe in the destiny of the white race or in the march of history. We are uncolonized in mind, therefore capable of resistance. We have not taken in our past the dictates or the self-images of those who had the Maxim gun or its modern equivalent. We've called them into question. Therefore, Afghanistan came into existence as an act of resistance, but with an enormously high cost. The cost was, one, centralization of power; second, an almost ethnic genocide involving the Hazaras of Afghanistan; and suppression of all forms of autonomy; and last but not least, suppression of freedom of movement. Afghans had been among the freest people in terms of moving and not being bounded by boundaries. With the centralization of state system, all this disappeared. But something else did happen. Islam became the focus of justice and the vehicle for giving women the right to inheritance, which no one on this side of the border ever had, and where you're still struggling with it. Afghan women, I can document again in full, in 19th century, sued their male kin, right, left, and center in the courts, and the state upheld their right. So we are not dealing with a single vision of Islam, we're dealing with multiple visions. I will deal with the state intellectual relationship later this afternoon when I talk about literature. But there's one thing that we need to take account of, and that is a periodization of recent Afghan history. I would distinguish between two broad periods between 1880 and 1978, namely the period of 1880 to 1929, and then the period 1929 to 1978, so again to be distinguished with 1955 as the crucial mark. The question here is that between 1880 and 1929, Afghans were the most heavily taxed people in the world, probably. The bulk of the revenue of the state came from taxes on land. After 1929, rural Afghanistan was among the least taxed areas in the world. In fact, the share of taxation from land significantly declined, and in 1976, it was only $1 million. This poses two questions. One, how did the state finance itself? And second, what were the implications of that to state-society relationship? And here we deal with two phenomena, and one of it needs invoking. Between 1929 and 1950, the state allowed the merchant class to run it completely. And during this period, unlike anything that has happened in Pakistan comparably, the Afghan merchant class was totally organized institutionally and transformed the economy through a logic of accumulation that was very distinct, and I've explained elsewhere. But there also comes now the problem of space in Afghanistan. And what we have to take account of, that since we were left by choice out of the transport revolution of the 1880s, because it would meant the disintegration of Afghanistan, the process was very slow and gradual. which meant the formation of a national market in wheat took place only in 1960s. So regional economies were a distinctive feature of Afghan society until 1960s. And after that, we can deal with a national market that was then ruptured by the Khalqi coup and the Soviet invasion. The second point is foreign aid and what it did to state-society relations. I have the figures here, so I might as well read it to give you just an idea. In 1953, the ordinary expenditure of the state was $22.23 million. In 1963, the ordinary state expenditure of the state amounted to $47.09 million, and the development expenditure to $90.89 million. This was a phenomenal jump. It's extremely small. It's extremely small, of course, if you take account of any history of any corporation. But in terms of Afghanistan, it meant a fundamental change. What it did do was that overnight it transformed a group that was a royal lineage into the major economic power in the country. The state became the sole employer of everyone. The state became the sole constructor of everything. And the state became the planner for everything. And allocation was not controlled by any democratic process. Hence, Afghans have had an enormous consciousness of the state, because it was the state that was impinging on everything, and it was the access to the state that defined one position in society. You could not make money apart from the state. You had to have access to the state to do anything. Which is an enormous burden that we carry, namely that the system of relationships is one of patron-client relationships from up downward, which meant that every question of relationship between two individuals in the society automatically became a political question. And given an ethno-linguistically diverse society, the language of politics became ethnic. Hence, the debate on the national language in 1970s, which was finally forcefully suppressed. It could not be permitted to go on. It's as a result of this that if we look at 1970s, that we look at a new phase of the state-society crisis. The first phase had come thanks to the Cold War. There are few strings attached. So it seemed at that point, when the Soviet premier offered $100 million with 2% interest. The strings that were attached, of course, were the removal of control of institutions of power from hands of Afghans to those abroad. The Soviets became the trainers of our military and of our intelligence. You started developing foci of interest that were ideologically, culturally, totally in terms of ruptures. And as it was the state that became the site of these struggles, society was left out of it. In 1970s, of course, Prince Dawood finally realized at the end of his term to turn around and forge new relationships. You know, individuals can be very fossilized. He was fossilized into the mentality of 1950s when he came to power, and thereby cost us dearly. And when he tried to turn, of course, he collapsed overnight because the society wasn't controlling these institutions.
Hundreds and thousands of reports, papers, studies, and surveys were written by Afghan and foreign experts on development projects which succeeded, and even more on such projects which failed. Failure of a project was usually the result of bad preparation and negligence. We should try to learn from earlier faults and avoid making the same mistakes once again during the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Third priority is a clear arrangement in order of the facts. Third priority is a clear arrangement and order of facts, informations, and also on books, articles, and so on. This should be done at the same time in a geographical order and by classification, for example, to tribes and Pashtuns, Tajik, Uzbek, and so on, and in categories and subjects. Such a special thesaurus for Afghanistan was elaborated by Foundation Bibliotheca Afghanica years ago with the help of experts in the different fields of knowledge. This key was translated into English by the University of Nebraska at Omaha and is used today by different Afghan study centers in Europe and the United States. And I'm lucky that also ARIC will use this key for its documentation, adding specific chapters on the reconstruction of Afghanistan. Almost 10,000 publications on Afghanistan are already systematically registered in form of a catalog or bibliography by using this key. I strongly suggest that this system should also be used here in Peshawar and later in Afghanistan. Even the National Archives in Kabul intend today to make its holding accessible with the help of this key. As it is based on a decimal classification, it can easily be adapted to Oriental as well as Western languages, and it fits perfectly for later computerization, which is already on the way. Fourth problem is the distribution of all this information to those who are in need of it. For this, modern technique should be used, like copying machine, microfiche, scanner, telefax, and so on. To do so, the necessary financial means must be provided. The results will compensate these expenses by far. Fifth function of such a documentation center is to store all these collected materials and informations for long-term historical research. Also, what happens today here in Peshawar, but also in Kabul, is part of Afghan history. All these publications, which are published by the Afghan resistance as well as by the PDPA, will be of great importance at a later date when the war situation is over, to understand what happened. And it would be a great damage to Afghan history if such publications here in Peshawar and in Kabul would be destroyed, would get lost. And I hope that Afghans will not burn all these books and throw it away the day they come back to Kabul. This documentation, this storage should be done in a safe place with good climatic conditions where all technical facilities are easily available. And above all, there must be a guarantee for long-term existence. An existence which does not end with the repatriation of the Afghan refugees, which should not be affected by ideological changes or by shifting of interests. Such a safe place is provided today by the Foundation Bibliotheca Afghanica under the supervision of the Swiss government. This will be our contribution to documentation for history. Today, there is one other special problem to keep in mind, that a scientific documentation center should be clearly distinguished from a center of political propaganda. That means it should try to keep strict neutrality vis-à-vis the different groups of Afghan resistance and the competing NGOs, as well as in view of Kabul, Moscow, Washington, the United Nations, and others. There should be some code of honor that informations are not delivered to be used for war, for disunity, or sheer propaganda, but only for peace, humanitarian aims, and scientific research for the common interest of the Afghan people. Such noble words are easy to tell, but difficult to follow in reality. But we should try to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the Swiss perhaps can teach us all some lessons about neutrality. I'm sorry to say we're going to be running over. We have 5 substantive presentations in this panel, as you've probably noticed. I hope that we can slide tea time up a little bit so that each person will have their share of time and so that we can take audience responses as well. Our next speaker is Erika Knabe, who has done absolutely essential work on the position of women in pre-war Afghanistan and has more to tell us today. Thank you very much.
I will. It's working. Ah, good. I would prefer to stay here. First, I want to thank Nancy and the committee who invited me to this conference. And I feel very honored to be able to take part in that. And I think that during the yesterday already kind of history has happened here, at least in kind of history of this conference. And at me, in my opinion, certain changes have happened, although I continue to be my old self. I am not going to talk about methods to observe changes, but I want to just point one thing out, and that is that I think the foreigners, as I am a foreigner to the Afghans, the foreigners are in a situation very often to be able, without danger, to speak about things that Afghans, for different reasons, are not able to mention freely. So maybe that makes an opportunity to use foreigners. I would like then to point out some losses or fear of losses in Afghan culture, which this war has brought the danger of. I don't know whether it is or has already happened or is happening, and which of it can be avoided. One thing I think that is happening in Afghanistan is that rapid urbanization takes place. And that is that people from the countryside within Afghanistan are running to the great cities and making them metropolis, monster cities. And in that happening also, their traditions from rural life cannot be followed up, because one thing is, which can be seen also in the camps, that people are clustered very densely together, and that the boundaries of myself and Hamsoyeman and my neighbor have been so narrow that the prerogatives of Namus are very difficult to hold. That is, that the women are endangered to be seen, to be observed by foreigners. And I think that this very colorful Afghan folkloric culture, I do not speak about the museum for anthropologists, but that this kind of culture with their traditional feasts is also fading away, where people are impoverished. And speaking about cultural loss, it is also the loss in values that is happening, the loss in values and the loss in material culture too. It can be seen very easily when comparing old products of handicraft with new products, that colors, patterns, and also the refinement of work is in the danger to get down. One thing I would like to mention is that in this war, there were certain virtues essential. That is, to be a warrior, not to be afraid to fight. But I am skeptical how the Afghans can quickly arrange to come back from the mental and psychological changes that war has caused in their minds. I am thinking of the young people who do not know much more than killing and trying to shelter themselves before being killed themselves. And I think that in their heads, in their minds, this cruelty and also the losses, all those dead in their own families, fathers, brothers, sisters, mothers, children killed, all these changes, how can they balance it to come back from resignation and hopelessness and depression and passivity to kind of a normal day-to-day life that, in comparison to the challenges of war and to the thrill of war, is maybe boring even. And the skills of peacetime, the skills of handicraft, the skills of farming, I think they are going to be lost or are already lost. And I think that is something very, very important to balance these losses. Another point to mention, I think, is that in this condition of urban life and unaccustomed urban life for rural people, the social control that always was omnipotent in Afghanistan, I think the control of one neighbor over the other neighbor, has come to an extent that it is hindering private life and hindering also changes. And there's one thing that I have seen with some fear. When I was last time here 2 years ago, I met some women in Islamic schools of the parties, and I saw them, and they were dressed like nuns, like European Christian nuns, and I asked them, what has happened to you? Why do you dress like that? And they told me, yeah, now we understand what Islam is. And I asked them, so before you have been non-religious, you have been bigana, you have been bidin, you have been kafir, you have, and they said, we are learning now. And I was very much afraid that the Afghan way of Islam, this cultural value and their interpretation of Islam is in danger. Just one word about Afghans in Europe. I have found there too that social control makes changes very, very difficult, even for Afghans living there, and especially for Afghan women. And one of the losses that you have to face, I think, are the young people growing up in Europe or in the US. Many of them are encultured now in those countries, and they had their schooling there, and they are making their plans to be there, to find jobs there, and to have their families there. One more point is that I think that Afghan men are getting so strict on their women because they have lost so many things, and to just put the line into the opposite, first Zamin was lost, then Zar was lost, so that Afghan men are forced to very much keep in control their women, Zan. And the last point, I think that revenge never allows for change, because revenge means you have done this to me, now I do the same thing to you, and again and again and again. And I think that is maybe the most difficult thing to do, in spite of all these family members that I think every Afghan has lost and feels mourning about them. In spite of that, reconciliation is the task for tomorrow, and that is something that every individual has to prepare himself for individually. I think that's it.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Tom Amy, who brings with him a very rich base of information on Afghan demographics.
My name is Tom Amy. My degrees are in what I guess you would call quantitative human geography. I presently work for the Office of the USAID Representative for Afghanistan Affairs, and I'm responsible for primary health care and basic education programs inside Afghanistan. I divide my time between Islamabad, Peshawar, Quetta, the Grand Trunk Road, and PIA. Since this is a conference in honor of Louis Dupree and a panel on documentation such as books, I'd like to say a little about both of these. 1971, so to speak, Afghanistan called me, and I was teaching at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I have on permanent loan from the geography department there as the first and only borrower Johannes Humlen's classic 1959 La Géographie de l'Afghanistan, written by a Dane in French, which, thanks to a tour in Morocco, I can now read. From 1971 to 75, I was privileged to work on USAID's demographic survey and sample census project, first in the Ministry of Planning and later in the Central Statistics Office. In the course of this, I believed that I could demonstrate that I had traveled further into more villages, if for a shorter time, than any other foreign guest, including Louis Dupree. It was, of course, during this time that my wife and I met Nancy and Louis. And being also somewhat of a new boy on the block, I remarked to him how much I enjoyed reading his book. At which point Louis became very agitated, wondering how I had read his book. I said I had an advance pre-publication order with Princeton University Press. He said he had never seen it in published form, and would I lend it to him? I said, well, no, since I had already lent it to someone else. Actually, it was the eschatological comments that I had written in the margins that I felt at that point justifiably prevented me from lending Louis's book to him. Later, as I came to know Louis and Nancy a little bit better, I realized that Louis enjoyed wide-ranging eschatological comments about his work, and I subsequently lent him the book, and he autographed it for me, saying something to the effect that Afghanistan brought us together. And I could tell you exactly what he said if I could only get the book back from whoever it was I lent it to. Okay, Afghanistan's population, its size, its spatial distribution, its growth, its characteristics, has been off and on my interest, my preoccupation even, for 19 years, from 1971 to now. What I am telling you today thus represents somewhat of an exploration of how you do demographic survey work, of any kind of survey work on a large and representative scale in Afghanistan. Something that was very definitely village-based, which ultimately passed through the filters of scientific sampling estimating, quality control, re-interviewing, utilization of all of the best documentation that was then available in Afghanistan, use of maps, use of air photos, use of male interviewers, use of female interviewers, which was said that you couldn't do it, but we did it slowly, quietly. It was possible. Codification of this, extraction somehow of demographic truth, leaving a very thorough documentation archive in the basement of the Ministry of, first floor of the Ministry of Planning when we got on the plane in 1975. I took with this, when I left, I took a lot of this stuff with me and it moldered in my basement in my house in Washington for a while until the spin of the wheel brought me back to the Afghan frontier. Since then, I've been trying to pull out some of this stuff, go back to the original printouts of 1973, 74, 75 data tapes, blend this with whatever empirically based survey information I can get in the camps in Iran, which is a major gap, and whatever the PDPA regime and others have done in Afghanistan since we left in 75. And eventually this all, and I've talked to a lot of people. I've talked to people in Peshawar. I've sought out hidden references. I've interviewed Afghans in Quetta who come from various, refugees who come from various parts of the country. And I've tried to meld all this in into a database and an interpretive paper which says, to the best of our knowledge, this is how many Afghans we can account for inside the country and out at the moment, working macro geographically downward from certain demographic parameters, and at the same time trying to build upward Wallace Wally by Wallace Wally, and see at the end how the two mesh and how they meet. Because it's only by looking at both that we begin to be able to reconcile many of the conflicting claims about how many Afghans and where do they live. My demographic colleagues assure me that since we now know more about China than we did before, that Afghanistan remains the world's greatest demographic enigma. I illustrate this enigma by two stories. When I first arrived in Afghanistan, a Ministry of Planning colleague said that sometime after World War II, he received a questionnaire from the United Nations asking for Afghanistan's population. He didn't know. No one knew. Answer: they convened a seminar of experts, not unlike those that have been gathered here, and they concluded that Afghanistan had a population of 12 million. Not 12 million exactly, of course, because then the numbers would look cooked. So they reported something around 12 million. The figure in the questionnaire went back into the file drawer in the Ministry of Planning, and then lo and behold, the next year another form came around. Said, but we just answered this. Well, okay, it's a different year, and surely we have grown in that year. How much have we grown? Well, we don't know. How much has Iran grown, and how much has Pakistan grown? Well, a little research could dig that out. Surely we have not grown more slowly than Iran and Pakistan. So consequently, we gathered up a growth rate and multiplied it by the population determined by the experts, and we got next year's population. Thus, starting from an arbitrary base with an arbitrary growth rate, neither one of them based upon representative and empirical evidence, we had official-looking estimates ranging from 16 to 19 million people in Afghanistan at the point that I stepped off the plane. Later on, another one of our colleagues said, you know, I was told in grade school that we had 12 million people. And when I went to high school, I was told we had 12 million people. And when I went to college, I was told we had 12 million people. And I stepped on the plane. I said to him, wait a minute, you'll get there yet. So that when the Afghan Demographic Studies project came out with an estimate of, and this is published in fact, 8,670,722 settled rural, 1,509,597 settled urban, give it 10,200,000 settled in 1973, vis-a-vis, quote, official estimates of 16 to 19 million. This was clearly a bit of a shock, and a number of people rushed in with very unscientific-based, quote, improvements or adjustments in these figures. Now, everyone who knew 2 paisa about Afghanistan at the time knew that it was then one of the poorest of the poor nations, and since you were generating GNP independently and then dividing it by population, also derived independently, the bigger your population, the poorer you were and the more aid you could get. And so when you came out quite a bit bigger, you might, gee, all of a sudden we're looking better than India and a few other countries. So this was a very, very severe issue. But I will say, to the great credit of the Afghan government at the time, we were never under any pressure to do anything or report anything but the truth. And to this, I am grateful to a number of the members of the previous regime. I subsequently met one of them on the steps of the Ministry of Planning in Khartoum, where we were both assigned at that point. And we greeted each other like long-lost friends, and he said, can you update what you did? And it so happened that in case the fickle finger should again assign me to the Northwest frontier, I had brought a small selection of stuff that I'd moved now between 4 different posts, and I produced an estimate for him. And he said, yes, that is about what we got independently when we went to check your information. All right, it's now 1978, it's now 1988, 89, I'm back here, and I decide, okay, let's go back and do this, let's go back and do what we can do. So I took our 73 results, and I made certain adjustments to them, and those were upward adjustments. I could demonstrate a 4.6% undercount in either spatial coverage due to boundaries of villages overlapping or not meeting other villages, and a certain amount of that could be due to quality control interviewing of the pregnancy history schedules with women that we had gone back and done after the major survey, and these I could justify a 4.6% undercount. I then gathered every bit of information I could on what was considered to be the national populations of the country at various times. And you can generate by this, by various demographic jiggery-pokery, 3 different sets of growth rates. One is the apparent growth rate, which is just saying if this is what it was in 74 and this is what it was in 79, this is how much it grew in between. And those rates were not demographic